Hello, family systems students. We're getting almost to the end of our laborious, lugubrious, fascinating, interesting exploration of key topics for our class as we move into deeper understanding of the basic theories of family systems and how we will, when I return, be able to apply these theories to cases, taking into consideration what we're learning about cultural diversity and the culturogram, and coming at our families with deep, soulful understanding and interventions, and then how to compose a workable treatment plan that is, I think, a little bit more substantive than what we're getting in her book, because I like it to be a little bit more like an essay. But I'll take you through that journey when I return. For now, I'd like us to turn to the Sue and Sue book. Isn't this just such a pretty book? Counseling the culturally diverse. And we're in chapter 5. And we're talking about certain kinds of ways that therapists can injure clients and families through barriers to cultural diversity sensitivity. And authors go through different ways of how this might happen. Blaming the client, which is so easy to do because clients can do things that make you want to blame them for their acting out. But it's so useful, and I keep myself learning how to do this, to come from this attitude, which is so missing in our own families, of understanding the source of the acting out or of the maladaptive behavior is coming from a self that's thwarted or crushed or traumatized or doesn't know how to speak on behalf of itself in a way that would produce a good reaction from another person, but instead might actually push them away or might push the helper away. So working with not blaming the client for their activities, but really understanding the cultural, the ethnic, the LGBTQ, whatever it is that's, as well as the essence of the self, if I can dare to be a little essentialist, that is you're trying to connect with. Objectifying the client. Again, when I'm teaching process 1, I'm very alert to keeping the student therapists from asking questions. Why do you think you do that? Where do you think that comes from? Those are not themselves bad questions, but it has the tendency of distancing the client from the therapist, instead of maybe telling a story or making contextualizing statements or saying it's very common for all of us to do these kinds of things. Ways of talking about issues that don't make the client feel like you're like sticking a fishhook in them. Being non-directive with the client. Sometimes clients, especially based on certain ethnicities and other cultures, would like direct advice, would like a suggestion, and it can make them feel that they trust you. Pathologizing the client, which again, the authors say, if you understand your own trauma and your own hurt and pain, you're going to help your folks a lot, rather than using helping people as a way to distance yourself from your own problems and issues. Again, also seeing race as a problem. I think that's just so interesting to consider when clients bring up race and cultural diversity. Some student therapists will feel, well, that's not really your issue, it's a human issue, and that's really, really can be very injurious, especially for a client who's different from you. And perceiving the client as paranoid, I think that's a big mistake that therapists make. When, let's say, my client who's African American will discuss certain things that are happening in the national sphere as set up by the power structure. And if you really think about what they're saying makes a lot of sense. And an empathic statement is a politically empathic statement. Very important. Effects of historical and current oppression. Very important when you're working with families to apprehend that much of the symptomology is coming from discourses of oppression. Again, lots of differentiating these topics in terms of the belief in a dominant group, the superiority of a dominant group, the belief of the inferiority of others. These are assumptions that people have when you scratch the surface. We all have them. Power to impose standards, manifestation in institutions, the invisible veil. I like this. Since people are products of cultural conditioning, page 154, their values and beliefs represent an invisible veil that operates outside the level of conscious awareness. As a result, people assume universality, that regardless of race, culture, ethnicity, or gender, everyone shares the nature of reality and truth. The assumption is erroneous, but is seldom questioned because it is firmly ingrained in our worldview. I think that's just brilliant. I encourage you to read the whole section. Historical manifestation of ethnocentric monoculturalism. Monocultural, page 155, ethnocentric biases, a long history in the United States. This concept, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's a kind of ethnocentric monoculturalism, that we're all part of the same culture, and we're not. Again, a lot of discussion on page 156 and 157 about surviving systemic oppression, how people do that. That to do so is itself a strength and an aspect of resilience, but that it comes at a great cost. The authors discuss the concept of mild dissociation, that sometimes you'll see people who are kind of numb, but not really numb, but have used it as a style of survival. Playing it cool, for example, is another thing the authors talk about. The authors also talk about that some people will communicate non-verbally because it's safer, and to be able to get those cues and to be able to interpret what the non-verbal cues are. Some really good stuff on page 159 about cultural credibility and attractiveness. The different qualities of the problem-solving set, where the client is concerned about obtaining correct information. The consistency set, people are operating under the consistency set whenever they change an opinion, belief, or behavior to make it consistent with other opinions, belief, or behaviors. A whole list of different kinds of ways that people manage to work with the dominant culture, and how they test the therapist. Culturally diverse clients will actively seek out disclosures on the part of the therapist to compare them with the information they have about the world. If the therapist passes the test, new information may be more readily accepted. Counselor credibility, different qualities, trustworthiness is very important. Credibility has two components, page 162, expertness and trustworthiness. And then they discuss what is expertness. In postmodernism, we're taught that the therapist should not be the expert, but in working with different cultures, you're asked to be an expert and to be a trustworthy expert in many cases. So take a look at all of that. That's really great stuff. Again, a whole lot of issues, a lot of discussion on page 169 about formation of worldviews. There's a little graph on page 169 that talks about different places where the locus of control and the locus of responsibility can be put. And maybe a little technical to read, but worth reading. External locus of control, internal locus of responsibility, and the implications for clinical practice. There's a good summary on page 174. It is important to realize that the history of race relations in the United States has influenced us to the point where we are extremely cautious about revealing to strangers our feelings and attitudes about race. In an interracial encounter with a stranger, i.e. in therapy, each party will attempt to discern gross or subtle racial attitudes of the other while minimizing vulnerability. Ethnocentric monoculturalism lies at the heart of oppressor-oppressed relationships that affect trust, mistrust, and self-disclosure in the therapeutic encounter. The 5 components of ethnocentric monoculturalism are belief in the superiority of one group over another, belief of inferiority of other groups, the power to impose standards on socially devalued groups, manifestation and support of institutions, and the invisibility of the imposition process. It is clear that past and present discrimination against certain culturally diverse groups is a tangible basis for minority distrust of the majority society. Majority group members are perceived as potential oppressors unless proven otherwise. Under such a sociopolitical atmosphere, marginalized groups may use several adaptive behaviors to prevent whites from knowing their true feelings. Because multicultural counseling may mirror the sentiments of the larger society, these modes of behavior and their detrimental effects may be enacted in the sessions. The fact that many marginalized clients are suspicious, mistrustful, and guarded in their actions with white therapists is certainly understandable in the light of this foregoing analysis. Counselors who are perceived by their clients as credible, and then in parentheses, expert and trustworthy, end parentheses, and attractive, in parentheses, similar. There's an interesting discussion of attractiveness. It's not what you think it means. It has to do with, I can relate to you. We're similar. Are better able to establish rapport with them than those therapists lacking these attributes. Interesting discussion. In multicultural counseling, client tests of trustworthiness and expertness are likely to enhance or negate the counselor's credibility. Many of these tests are likely to prove challenging to well-intentioned therapists. Cultural competence means understanding the worldview of diverse clients. Locus of control, people's belief that they can shape their own fate, or that chance or luck determines outcomes. And locus of responsibility, in parentheses, causation resides in the person or system, end parentheses. Interactive form 4 major worldviews that explain possible majority and diverse client perceptions and interactions. And then these themes are reduced to acronyms: IC-IR, EC-IR, EC-ER, and IC-ER. If you go back and read the chapter, you'll understand what they're referring to. We summarize therapeutic implications for each of these dimensions of worldviews. So that's the end of that chapter. I'd like to discuss with you in the next video microaggressions. Okay, almost done.